That Father's Day, amidst a lively family gathering, I stood silently watching the father who had despised and rejected me for 28 years. He raised his glass with smug pride, proclaiming his pride in his biological children, while I was merely an extraneous shadow. But when the door swung open, a millionaire strode in, placed his hand on my shoulder, and declared loudly, "This is my son." The room fell deathly silent. The truth buried for so many years was finally laid bare, and from that moment my world changed completely. Hello, my name is Dean Caldwell. I'm 28 years old, living a life that many might call ordinary. I'm a high school literature teacher, standing in front of a classroom each day, sharing stories from books and returning at night to a small rented apartment in the suburbs, where the hum of the TV is my only companion. I'm calm, reserved, and always try to keep things under control. But if you ask me about my childhood, my family, or the scars in my heart, I'd hesitate. Not because I don't want to talk, but because every time I recall those memories, my heart aches, as if an invisible hand is squeezing it tightly. I grew up in a large house that on the surface seemed perfect. The Caldwell family, as the townsfolk called it, was the epitome of a model family. My father, Malachi Caldwell, was a tall, imposing man with a booming voice, always dressed in impeccable suits and a confident smile. He worked in real estate and everyone respected him. A successful, decisive man who always seemed to know what he wanted. My mother, Paisley Caldwell, was his complete opposite. She was gentle, with warm brown eyes and a melancholic smile. She loved flowers and spent afternoons knitting on the porch, but she was frail, always avoiding arguments and rarely daring to stand up to my father. Then there were my younger brothers, Michael, James, and Ethan, miniature versions of our father. Michael, 25, was a promising law student, always making our father proud with his sharp speeches. James, 23, had just graduated as an engineer, bringing home small but promising projects. And Ethan, only 20, was a college student with a keen business sense, like a younger version of our father. They were the siblings my father always praised at gatherings, the children who brought honor to the Caldwell name. And me? I was Dean, the eldest, but always the outsider in that perfect family portrait. From a young age, I sensed the difference. My father never looked at me with the same pride he showed my brothers. When I brought home straight-A report cards, he'd glance at them and nod, as if it was something I was expected to do. But when Michael won a school speech contest or James built a technical model, the house would erupt in celebration. I remember when I was 13, I spent an entire month painting a large portrait of our family, intending to give it to my father for Father's Day. I carefully depicted everyone from my mother's smile to Ethan's favorite jacket, who was only 5 at the time. When I presented the painting to my father, he barely looked at it, gave a faint smile, and said, "Childish. You should learn to do something more practical." The painting was folded up, tucked into a corner of a cupboard, and I never mentioned it again. Words like those, though seemingly trivial, cut into me like knives. I began to believe I wasn't good enough, that something was inherently wrong with me. I tried harder, studied better, behaved better, but it was never enough. My father always found a reason to criticize. "Dean, stand up straight, don't slouch like a loser. Dean, you talk without a shred of confidence. Look at your brothers and learn from them." Those words, repeated over and over, weighed on my chest like heavy stones. My mother was the only source of warmth in that house. She would secretly hug me when my father wasn't home, whispering that I was a wonderful boy and that she was proud of me. But those words were never enough to soothe the loneliness. My mother was weak. She feared my father and his outbursts. Once, when I was 12, my father scolded me for breaking one of his favorite glass cups. He yelled, calling me useless, while I stood there, tears streaming down my face. My mother stood in the corner, her hands clenched, eyes brimming with tears, but she said nothing. After my father stormed off, she quietly pulled me into the kitchen, wiped my tears, and made me a sandwich. "Don't be sad, Dean," she said, her voice trembling. "Your father's just stressed. But deep down, I knew she was as powerless as I was. Holidays were the times I dreaded most. Christmas, Thanksgiving, Father's Day, days when families gathered and laughed together, were the days I felt like an outsider. I still remember Thanksgiving when I was 15. The whole family gathered, the table laden with delicious food, laughter echoing through the house. My brothers shared their achievements. Michael boasted about a school award. James talked about a science model, and Ethan chattered about a football game he watched with our father. My father proudly patted their shoulders, bragging to relatives. I sat at the corner of the table, eating quietly, trying not to draw attention. But as if it were a habit, my father turned to me, his tone mocking. "Dean, got anything to share? Or are you still just burying your nose in books?" The table burst into laughter as if it were a harmless joke. To me, it felt like a punch to the chest. I forced a smile, mumbled something about a recent high test score, but no one cared. My mother looked at me with apologetic eyes, but she remained silent. Moments like that repeated year after year. I learned to shrink myself, to become a shadow in my own home. I stopped trying to vie for attention or recognition from my father. I just wanted to survive the holidays, the family dinners, the contemptuous glances. But deep inside, I couldn't stop wondering, why? Why was I never good enough? Why was I always on the outside? When I grew up, I left home as soon as I could. I chose to become a teacher, not because it was a grand dream, but because it was safe and quiet. I wanted a life where I didn't have to prove myself or chase anyone's approval. I rented a small apartment, cooked my own meals, did my own laundry, and took care of myself. I lived independently, but that independence wasn't freedom. It was my way of escaping the feeling of unworthiness, escaping the shadow of the Caldwell family. But no matter how hard I tried, the scars from my childhood lingered, smoldering like a fire that never went out. Every time the phone rang, every time my mother called to check in, I could hear my father's voice from the past, reminding me I never belonged there. Every time Father's Day approached, I braced myself for the mocking words and cold glances. I had learned to accept that I was an outsider, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Some nights, sitting alone in my apartment, I wondered if I could ever change anything. Would there ever be a day when I'd find answers to the questions that had haunted me for years? I didn't know, but deep down I felt that something was waiting for me, a truth I had never dared to face. And I found the answer on a late evening after finishing a tutoring session as I drove my old car back home. The dashboard clock showed nearly 10 o'clock at night, and the crisp autumn air slipped through the slightly open window. I was exhausted, not from work, but from the thoughts that kept swirling in my mind. I turned on the radio, hoping the music would dispel the heaviness I felt. The road I took passed through an old neighborhood where dim yellow streetlights barely illuminated a few meters ahead. I usually avoided this area at night, but tonight I just wanted to get home faster. As I turned into a narrow alley, a shortcut to the main road, I suddenly froze. There was a strange noise, like someone groaning, mixed with the harsh sounds of fists hitting flesh. I slowed down, my heart starting to race. In the darkness, under the faint glow of a streetlight, I saw a scene that made my blood run cold. A middle-aged man in a gray coat was slumped on the cold ground. Surrounding him were 3 young men, their faces menacing, taking turns kicking him. Blood oozed from the man's mouth and forehead, his hands weakly trying to shield his head, but it was clear he had no strength left to fight back. The thugs laughed as if this was just a game to them. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my breathing rapid. I wasn't a hero. I'd never thought I had the courage to confront anyone, let alone a group of thugs. But seeing that man, helpless and in pain, I couldn't just drive on. I didn't think too much. I pressed the horn hard, the piercing sound echoing through the quiet alley. At the same time, I switched on the high beams, the bright white light flooding straight onto the group of thugs. "Hey, stop it right now or I'll call the police," I shouted, my voice trembling but trying to sound firm. The 3 of them flinched, turning to look at me. For a moment, I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. But then one of them muttered something, likely afraid of being caught. They glared at me, then hurriedly fled, their figures disappearing into the darkness. I let out a shaky breath, my hands still trembling as I opened the car door. I ran to the man and knelt beside him. "Sir, are you okay? Can you hear me?" My voice cracked. He lay motionless, his breathing faint, a stab wound in his abdomen, blood soaking a large patch of his clothing. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone to call for help. "Hello, I need an ambulance now. Someone's been attacked. He's losing a lot of blood in the alley on Elm Street near the 3rd intersection." I practically shouted into the phone, trying to stay calm. While waiting for the ambulance, I tried to help the man move out of the dark corner toward the light of the street lamp. He was heavier than I expected, his body trembling in waves, but his eyes, though clouded with pain, looked at me with a strange glint, as if trying to say something. "Thank you, young man," he whispered, his voice so weak I had to lean in to hear. "It's okay, don't talk. The ambulance is coming," I replied, hiding the fear in my heart. The ambulance arrived after a few minutes that felt like an eternity. The paramedics quickly placed him on a stretcher, and I followed them to the hospital, not entirely sure why I did. Perhaps I felt I needed to be there to know he'd be okay. On the way, I sat in the back, watching the stranger lying motionless, my heart filled with unease. I didn't know who he was, but something about him held my gaze. His weathered face, his closed eyes, and the salt and pepper hair falling messily across his forehead. At the hospital, the atmosphere was chaotic. Doctors and nurses rushed back and forth, the beeping of machines blending with urgent voices. I stood outside the emergency room, hands clasped tightly, waiting for news. A doctor who seemed to be in charge came out with a tense expression. "He's lost a lot of blood and his condition is critical. His blood type is AB negative, which is quite rare, and the hospital's blood bank doesn't have enough. We're trying to contact other hospitals, but..." He trailed off, his eyes filled with worry. I don't know what compelled me to speak. Maybe it was adrenaline, maybe a vague sense of responsibility. "Doctor, test my blood to see if it's a match," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. The doctor looked at me, slightly surprised, but nodded. "All right, come with me." 15 minutes later, the test results came back, and I could hardly believe my ears. "You have AB negative blood, a perfect match," the doctor said, his tone tinged with relief. "Are you willing to donate?" I nodded without hesitation. In the blood donation room, I lay on the bed, watching the red blood flow through the tube. The man had been taken into surgery, and all I could do was pray he'd pull through. The nurse drawing my blood, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, suddenly looked at me, then at the man's chart. She smiled and said casually, "How strange. You two not only share a rare blood type, but you even look alike. If I didn't know better, I'd think you were father and son." I laughed, but it was a forced smile. "Just a coincidence, I'm sure," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But deep inside, a strange feeling stirred, as if a door had just cracked open, revealing a secret I wasn't ready to face. I shook my head, telling myself it was just an offhand remark. When I left the hospital, it was nearly dawn. I drove home, my mind exhausted but unable to stop thinking about the man, the doctor's words, and the strange feeling that clung to me. I gave a weak smile to my reflection in the rearview mirror, trying to brush off the tangled thoughts. Just an ordinary night. Just a random coincidence, I told myself. The next morning, I woke up with stinging eyes after a nearly sleepless night. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, illuminating my small, tidy apartment, a modest place just enough to hold the quiet days of a high school teacher. I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and turned on the TV to fill the morning silence. I didn't have a habit of eating breakfast at home. Instead, I preferred the little cafe at the street corner, with its worn wooden tables and the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread. Today was no exception. I grabbed my coffee mug, stepped out of the house, and tried to leave the thoughts of last night behind. The cafe was quiet on Saturday morning, with only a few customers silently reading newspapers or scrolling on their phones. I chose my usual corner, ordered a plate of egg and toast, and opened my laptop to check work emails. The TV on the wall was playing the morning news, the anchor's voice steady but clear. I wasn't paying much attention until a name rang out, making me freeze, the spoonful of egg in my hand dropping onto the plate. Businessman Alexander Hale, 55 years old, founder and CEO of Hale International Resorts, a corporation owning a chain of luxury hotels and resorts spanning the Americas, Europe, and Asia, narrowly escaped death after an unexpected attack last night. He was saved by an anonymous citizen and is now recovering in the hospital. I looked up, my eyes glued to the screen. The image of a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a weathered but authoritative face appeared in the broadcast. It was him, the man I had saved in the alley last night. My heart pounded as if someone had just struck my chest. Alexander Hale, a name that was once unfamiliar but now tied to me by a thread I couldn't explain. The anonymous citizen. That was me. But I didn't want anyone to know, didn't want attention, didn't need gratitude. I just wanted him to be okay. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my normal routine. Classes, lectures, evening tutoring sessions, all went on as usual, but something inside me had shifted. I couldn't stop thinking about Alexander Hale, about his eyes when he whispered his thanks, about the strange feeling I had standing near him. Out of curiosity, I began searching for information about him online. Articles hailed him as a legend in the hospitality industry, a self-made man who rose from nothing with a vision that turned Hale International Resorts into a global icon. But none of the articles mentioned his family. No wife, no children. There were only images of him standing alone at press conferences, his deep eyes seeming to hold an untold story. Then one afternoon, about a week after that fateful night, my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I hesitated but answered. "Hello, is this Dean Caldwell?" The voice on the other end was warm, slightly raspy, but full of life. I nodded. "Yes, that's me. Who's this?" "I'm Alexander Hale," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "You're the one who saved me that night, aren't you? I'd like to meet you to say thank you." I was stunned, unsure how to respond. Meet him? A renowned businessman like Alexander Hale wanted to meet an ordinary teacher like me? I stammered my agreement, and we arranged to meet at a small cafe near the city center that weekend. When I walked into the cafe, I recognized him immediately. He was sitting in a corner wearing a simple dress shirt, no longer looking as haggard as he had that night. He looked up, smiled, and my heart beat faster. There was something about that smile, the way he looked at me, that felt both familiar and unfamiliar. "Dean." He stood up, shaking my hand, his grip warm and firm. "Thank you. If it weren't for you, I probably wouldn't be sitting here." I gave an awkward smile, unaccustomed to being the center of attention. "I was just in the right place at the right time, sir," I said. But he shook his head, his expression serious. "No, Dean. You chose to act to save me instead of driving away. Not everyone would do that." We talked, starting with small talk, but the more we spoke, the more I noticed strange similarities between us. He was calm, spoke slowly, with a rare sincerity. He liked his coffee black, no sugar, just like me. He shared stories of his simpler days as a young man, preferring park walks over lavish parties. And sometimes when he looked at me, I felt like he noticed the similarities too. After a few meetings, he began asking more about me, my family, my childhood, my parents. I shared, but hesitantly, reluctant to reopen old wounds. I spoke of my mother, her gentleness, and my father, who always made me feel inadequate. When I mentioned my mother's name, Paisley Caldwell, I saw him freeze as if someone had yanked him backward. His hands tightened around his coffee mug, his eyes blank for a moment. "Paisley Caldwell," he repeated, his voice trembling. "You said your mother's name is Paisley Caldwell?" I nodded, unsure why my heart was racing. "Yes, that's her name." He fell silent, staring at me, then suddenly told a story I never could have anticipated. He said that in his youth he had loved a woman named Paisley. They met in a small town where he worked at a diner to pay for college. Their love was intense but fraught with obstacles. He wanted to go far and build a career while she longed for a stable life and a family. In the end, they parted ways, not out of anger, but because their paths diverged. I never forgot her, he said, his voice heavy as if reliving painful memories. I don't know where she is now or how she's doing. He gave a distracted smile, then said something that stopped me cold. What a coincidence. She has the same name as your mother. I sat there, frozen. Too many coincidences. The rare blood type, the eyes, the way he spoke, and now my mother's name. I wanted to laugh, to say it was just a random story, but I couldn't. Something in his voice, in his eyes, made me feel a storm brewing in my heart. The meeting ended strangely. He suddenly asked to borrow my jacket, saying he'd forgotten his and had to meet someone urgently. I handed it to him, though my mind was full of doubts. Thank you, Dean, he said, patting my shoulder. We'll see each other again soon. He left, leaving me with an unnamed sense of unease. Half a month passed, but the unease didn't fade. It clung to me, creeping into my fleeting dreams and quiet moments in my small apartment. I tried to focus on work, literature lessons, evening tutoring sessions, but my mind kept drifting to Alexander Hale, to his story of a youthful love, to the name Paisley. I told myself I was overthinking it. Then one afternoon, as I stepped out of the school, my phone rang. It was him, Alexander Hale. Dean. His voice on the other end was still warm, but this time there was an urgency, as if he were holding back strong emotions. Are you free? I need to meet you. It's important. My heart raced, a sense of foreboding rising within me. I agreed, and we arranged to meet at a small park near my home where the maple trees were turning red in the glow of the sunset. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting on a wooden bench holding a brown envelope. He wore a simple suit, but his eyes were heavy, as if carrying a monumental secret. I sat down beside him, trying to appear calm, but my hands trembled slightly as they touched the cold bench. Dean, he began, his voice low. I've been thinking a lot since our last meeting. There's something I need to show you. He handed me the envelope, his eyes never leaving my face, as if searching for a reaction. Open it, he said, his gaze steady. I opened the envelope, my hands shaking slightly. Inside was a sheet of paper, a DNA test result. My eyes scanned the lines, the numbers, and then my heart seemed to stop as I read the final line. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. I looked up at him, my mouth dry. What does this mean? I asked, though deep down I was starting to understand. He took a deep breath, his voice trembling but resolute. Dean, you're my son. The world around me seemed to collapse. I sat there, stunned, the paper suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. Alexander Hale, the man I saved in the alley, the renowned businessman on TV, was my biological father. That meant Malachi Caldwell, the father I grew up with, the one who mocked and belittled me for years, wasn't my real father. Everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, my childhood, shattered like a broken mirror. I wanted to say something, to deny it, to shout that this was a mistake. But deep inside, I knew it was true. The pieces started falling into place. The coldness of my father, my mother's guilty looks, the doctor's offhand comment about our rare blood type and our resemblance. My chest ached as if someone were squeezing my heart. Why? I whispered, unsure if I was asking him or myself. Why didn't anyone tell me? Alexander looked at me, his eyes filled with pain. I didn't know, Dean, he said. I didn't know about you until we met. After you told me about your mother, about Paisley, I had my suspicions. I took your jacket to run a DNA test. I needed to be sure. And now I know you're my son. I'm sorry you had to grow up not knowing who your real father was. His apology cut like a knife, both painful and soothing. I didn't know how to feel. Hurt, because my entire childhood was spent under scorn, feeling like I was never good enough. Angry because my mother hid this truth, letting me endure Malachi's harsh words without explanation. Angry at myself for believing I was lesser, for letting those words shape who I was. But amidst the storm of emotions, there was a flicker of relief, as if an invisible burden had finally been lifted. I no longer had to wonder why I was treated differently. I no longer had to blame myself. But with that relief came fear. If this truth came to light, everything would change. The already fractured Caldwell family would completely fall apart. What would happen to my mother when the secret she'd kept for so long was exposed? How would my brothers, always favored by our father, look at me? And who would I, Dean Caldwell, become when I no longer carried that name, no longer belonged to the house I grew up in? Alexander seemed to sense the chaos within me. He placed his hand on my shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. Dean, I want to claim you. I want to publicly acknowledge you as my son. I want to bring you into my life, give you the place you deserve. You shouldn't have to live in the shadows, shouldn't have to endure what you've been through. His offer left me speechless. Part of me yearned to accept, to be loved, recognized, to belong somewhere I wasn't an outsider. But another part was terrified. I didn't know if I had the courage to face this truth, to step into a completely new world, to leave behind what was familiar, no matter how painful it had been. I need time, I said, my voice hoarse. I need to think. He nodded, his eyes full of understanding. I understand, Dean. I'll wait. Take your time, and when you're ready, I'll be here. He stood up, leaving me on the bench with the DNA test result in my hands and a storm of emotions in my heart. I sat there watching the maple leaves fall in the sunset's glow, feeling like I was standing at a crossroads. Pain, anger, relief, and confusion all swirling within me. The days that followed, I lived like a shadow. I went to teach, stood in front of my classes, talking about stories from books, but my mind was elsewhere, lost between the past and the present. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw Alexander's eyes, and every time I thought of my mother, my heart ached. Why didn't she say anything? Why did she let me grow up under Malachi's coldness, feeling like an unwanted extra? I wanted to be angry with her, but whenever I recalled her guilty eyes, I couldn't. I only felt a deep, piercing pain, as if my entire childhood had been a lie. Father's Day was approaching, and the Caldwell household was buzzing with excitement. I overheard my mother on the phone, her voice full of enthusiasm as she talked about the party at home. My brothers, Michael, James, and Ethan, were all assigned important roles. Ethan would prepare a speech to honor our father. James was in charge of setting up the dinner table, and Michael, as usual, would handle coordinating with relatives. Everyone was busy, laughing as if this were a sacred holiday, a time for the family to gather and celebrate Malachi Caldwell, the exemplary father, the successful man. And me? I wasn't mentioned. Not a single call, not a single text. I was as good as invisible in their plans. Part of me was used to it. Holidays were always like this, moments when I was pushed to the sidelines. But this time, after learning the truth about my lineage, their silence wasn't just neglect. It was another sharp, cruel stab. Then one afternoon, as I was preparing materials for class, my phone rang. It was Malachi. His voice was cold as always. "Dean," he said without so much as a greeting, "don't come to the Father's Day party. This day is only for my real children." I stood there, gripping the phone tightly, feeling the blood in my veins turn to ice. My real children. His words were like a slap to the face, sharp and humiliating. I wanted to respond, to scream that I knew the truth, that he wasn't my father, but I couldn't. The words caught in my throat, and I only mumbled, "All right, have a good time," before he hung up. I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. The pain I'd suppressed for years surged forth like a violent wave, drowning me. This wasn't just exclusion anymore. It was a complete denial of my place as a son. Old memories flooded back. Times when my father called me useless. Times I tried to please him only to receive his scornful glares. And now, I understood why. He knew. Perhaps he had always suspected or even known for certain that I wasn't his biological son. And he had used that truth to torment me, to make me an outsider in my own family. But in that dark moment, a fire ignited within me. Not pain, but anger. I was tired of bowing my head, tired of enduring. The DNA test result still tucked in my desk drawer wasn't just proof. It was the key to ending this cycle of humiliation, to reclaiming myself. I could no longer live in the shadow of lies. That night, I returned to my apartment, my mind in turmoil. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, memories and emotions intertwining like an old film reel. I thought of my mother, her guilty eyes whenever my father scolded me. I thought of my brothers who never truly saw me as one of them. And I thought of Alexander Hale, the biological father I never knew, who looked at me with eyes full of love and regret. All night I lay awake, wrestling with myself. Should I stay silent, continue living as a shadow? Or should I confront the truth, even if it meant destroying everything? At dawn, as the first light of morning broke, I picked up my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed Alexander's number. He answered immediately, his voice as warm as ever. "Dean, what's wrong?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mr. Hale," I said, "I want to tell you about what I've been through. About my father. No, about Malachi Caldwell. About how he treated me, about the years I was pushed aside, and I want it to end." I poured it all out, the mocking words from Malachi, the times I was excluded, and the call yesterday when he bluntly told me I wasn't his son. I spoke of the pain, the humiliation, and the awakening within me. "I want to go to the Father's Day party at the Caldwell house," I said, my voice firmer than ever. "But not as Malachi's son. I want you to come with me. I want to reveal the truth, to let everyone know who I am and to put an end to this pain." There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then Alexander spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Dean, I'll be there. We'll face this together." I smiled, though my eyes stung with tears. For the first time in my life, I felt I was no longer alone. Father's Day arrived, bringing with it the familiar festive atmosphere I had never truly been a part of. From early morning, my phone buzzed with messages in the family group chat, where my brothers discussed the party at the Caldwell house with enthusiasm. I wasn't surprised, but each message felt like a small stab, a reminder of the years filled with hurt. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my dark blue dress shirt, the nicest one I owned. Today I wasn't attending as Dean Caldwell, the despised son. I was going as the son of Alexander Hale, armed with the truth and determined to end the days of living in the shadows. I took a deep breath, trying to suppress the trembling within me. Then I stepped out of the house, driving to meet Alexander at a small cafe before heading to the Caldwell house together. He was already there, sitting in his usual corner, calm but with resolute eyes. He wore a simple gray suit, exuding the aura of a seasoned man. When he saw me, he stood up and smiled. "Ready, Dean?" he asked, his voice warm. I nodded, though my heart was pounding. "Ready," I said, despite the lingering fear inside. We drove to the Caldwell house, the large home with brightly lit windows and the sound of lively chatter spilling out from within. I could hear my mother's gentle but excited voice and Malachi's booming, self-assured tone, as always. The dining table was surely set lavishly, with dishes my mother had spent a week preparing, expensive bottles of wine, and endless toasts from relatives. This was Malachi's stage, where he always shone, where he was celebrated as the exemplary father. I parked the car in front of the gate, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Alexander placed a hand on my shoulder, his eyes reassuring. "We're doing this for you, Dean," he said. "Because you deserve to know the truth, and the world deserves to know who you are." I nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. We walked up the path, each step feeling heavier. I could hear the laughter from inside, the clinking of wine glasses, and Malachi's voice recounting a story about Michael's success in law. The large oak door loomed before us, I glanced at Alexander, who nodded, and I pushed it open. The sounds inside halted abruptly, as if time itself had frozen. All eyes turned toward me as I stepped in, with Alexander by my side, a man none in the room had met except for my mother. The warm, festive atmosphere turned heavy, as if a cold wind had swept through. Malachi sat at the head of the table, the center of attention, a glass of wine in hand. He was laughing, boasting about his real children, about how Michael, James, and Ethan had brought honor to the Caldwell name. But when he saw me, his smile vanished, his eyes narrowed, his face shifting from surprise to anger. "Dean, what are you doing here?" he roared, his voice thick with rage. "I told you not to come. This day isn't for you." His words, sharp as a blade, cut into my heart. But this time I didn't bow my head, I didn't retreat. I stood tall, meeting his gaze, the anger within me flaring like a fire. My brothers, Michael, James, and Ethan, sat around the table bewildered, their eyes shifting between me and the man beside me. My mother stood in the corner of the room holding a tray of desserts, her face pale as if she'd seen a ghost from her past. When her eyes met Alexander's, her hands trembled, and the tray slipped from her grasp, crashing to the floor with a sharp clatter. Everyone flinched, but she seemed oblivious. Her eyes were locked on Alexander, as if time had rewound to the days when she was young, when they loved each other in a small town before everything fell apart. I saw the guilt in her eyes, a deep pain she had buried for years. She knew who Alexander was. She knew the truth I was about to reveal, and I saw her struggle to hold it together, her lips pressed tightly, her hands clenched as if to contain the flood of emotions. But she couldn't stay still. She hurried toward me, her voice trembling, almost pleading. "Dean, please, go home," she whispered, grabbing my hand, her eyes filled with panic. "Don't say anything. I'm begging you, let this go." Her words were another knife, not out of scorn, but out of desperation. She knew what was coming, and she was afraid. For me, for the family, for herself. I held her hand, feeling the trembling in her thin fingers. "Mom," I said, my voice hoarse but resolute, "I can't stay silent anymore. I have to do this for me and for the truth." She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she said nothing more. She stepped back as if realizing she couldn't stop me. Malachi stood up, striding toward me, his fists clenched as if ready to teach me a lesson. "Who do you think you are, barging in here?" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the room. But before he could get closer, Alexander stepped forward, positioning himself between me and Malachi. His calm but commanding presence made Malachi pause. "Who are you?" Malachi growled, his eyes blazing with defiance. Alexander didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept across the room, from the stunned faces of my brothers to the curious eyes of relatives and guests. Then he locked eyes with Malachi, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "I am Alexander Hale, founder of Hale International Resorts," he said, each word carved into the air. "And I'm here to say that Dean Caldwell is my biological son, not yours." The room fell into a deathly silence. Whispers ceased. The clinking of wine glasses stopped. I felt every eye on me, piercing like sharp needles. But this time, I didn't lower my head. I stood there beside my real father, my heart pounding but no longer trembling. I looked at Malachi, the man I had once called father, and saw his face shift from anger to shock. My mother, standing in the corner, covered her face, her hands trembling, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her eyes, filled with pain and regret, seemed to confirm everything. Alexander pulled a brown envelope from his jacket, opened it, and held up the DNA test result. "This is the proof," he said, his voice ringing like a proclamation. "The test shows Dean is my son with a 99.9% probability. There's no room for doubt." He handed the paper to a nearby relative, and it quickly passed through the guest's hands like a spark spreading through dry grass. Whispers began to rise, soft but sharp, like a swarm of bees. Malachi stood there, his face flushed red, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I met his gaze, and for the first time I saw a flicker of panic. He wasn't entirely surprised. Perhaps he had suspected for years, had sensed the truth in my mother's glances, in the differences between me and my brothers. But to have it exposed in front of the entire family, relatives, and guests was something he never anticipated. "Liar!" he roared, turning to my mother, pointing at her accusingly. "Paisley, you deceived me all these years. You made a fool of me in front of everyone." My mother shrank back, clutching her chest as if shielding herself from his wrath. She said nothing, only lowered her head, tears falling to the floor. I wanted to run to her, to hold her, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. I was angry at her for hiding the truth, but seeing her now, frail and broken, I could only feel pity. Malachi wasn't done. He turned to me, his eyes blazing like fire. "And you, Dean," he growled, "who do you think you are? A bastard, a useless thing I wasted my time raising. You dare come here, dare ruin this day, dare tarnish this family?" Each word was like a knife, but this time they didn't wound me as they once had. I stood tall, meeting his gaze, and for the first time in my life I felt no fear. "I'm not your son," I said, my voice calm but resolute, "and I don't need your recognition anymore. For 28 years you never treated me like a son. I've endured enough." My words landed like a stone thrown into a still lake. My brothers, Michael, James, and Ethan, sat frozen, their faces a mix of confusion and unease. Relatives and guests whispered louder, their eyes darting between me and Malachi. The atmosphere in the room was no longer that of a celebration. It felt like an unspoken trial, with Malachi laid bare before everyone. I stood there beside my real father, my heart heavy yet relieved. The truth at last had been brought to light. The years I spent in the shadows, enduring insults and scorn, now had an explanation. I was no longer the outsider, the son who wasn't good enough. I was Dean, the son of Alexander Hale, and for the first time I felt I had the right to hold my head high. But even as the truth set me free, my heart still ached. I looked at my mother, the woman who had loved me in her fragile way, and saw her shattered. I looked at Malachi, the man who raised me but never truly was my father, and I no longer felt anger toward him. I saw only a man consumed by his own pride, and I looked at Alexander, the father I never knew, standing beside me, ready to protect me. In the days following the party, the truth about my lineage spread like wildfire. The Caldwell family, once a symbol of perfection in the eyes of relatives and neighbors, became the subject of fervent gossip. I overheard whispers through acquaintances, through sneaky messages in the family group chat I was no longer part of. Dean isn't Malachi's son? Alexander Hale, the hotel tycoon, is his real father? Malachi must be humiliated, exposed like that in front of everyone. Malachi's reputation, which he had built over years, crumbled like a sandcastle. He was once the exemplary father, the successful man, but now he was merely a figure whose deceit had been laid bare. Malachi, in his fury, grew even more authoritarian. I heard from my mother through a tearful brief phone call that he forbade anyone from mentioning my name. He shouted at anyone who dared ask about the events at the party, as if silence could erase the truth. But that very silence betrayed him. Every time he refused to face the questions, every time he roared to shut them down, he only proved his failure, not just as a father, but as a human being. My mother, meanwhile, was completely broken. I knew this from her short messages, her trembling and frail voice over the phone. "Dean, I'm sorry," she said, choking back sobs. "I thought keeping quiet would protect you, but I was wrong. I let you suffer." Her apology broke my heart. I wanted to be angry, to ask why she let me grow up under Malachi's contempt, but I couldn't. I saw only a woman trapped between love and fear who had tried to shield me in the way she thought was right, even though it caused me deep pain. My brothers, Michael, James, and Ethan, looked at me differently now. I no longer saw them, but I heard through relatives. Michael, only 25 and studying law, always so proud, was jealous that I was now the son of a wealthy, powerful businessman. James, 23 and newly graduated as an engineer, feared I would surpass them with Alexander's support. And Ethan, just 20, who used to follow me around when he was little, was now silent, his eyes filled with confusion and rivalry. I remembered the days when I took Ethan to the park, when I helped James with his homework. But now Malachi's favoritism had built a wall between us. They feared I would become the heir to Hale International Resorts, and part of them worried I might seek revenge. As for me, I stood at the greatest turning point of my life. I no longer carried the Caldwell name, no longer the eldest son pushed to the sidelines in that family. The weight of years, the humiliation, the pain, the self-doubt gave way to a new resolve. I wanted to live true to my worth, no longer defined by Malachi's scorn or my mother's guilty glances. I wanted to be Dean, the son of Alexander Hale, and I wanted to prove I was worthy of that name. Alexander didn't let me face this journey alone. A week after the party, he publicly acknowledged me before the world and his company. At a press conference at Hale International Resorts headquarters, he stood before hundreds of employees and reporters, his voice ringing with pride. Dean is my son, and I'm overjoyed to welcome him into our family. He will join me not just as a son, but as part of this company's future. I stood beside him, my heart pounding, feeling the eyes of everyone, from curiosity to admiration, focused on me. For the first time, I felt seen, not as a shadow, but as a person of value. But before stepping into this new world, Alexander arranged a small meeting, just the three of us, him, me, and my mother. We sat in a warm room at his mansion where the light from the fireplace danced across the paintings on the walls, creating an atmosphere both intimate and heavy. My mother walked in, looking exhausted, as if the past days had drained her vitality. Her eyes were red, shadowed by deep circles, but when she saw me, she managed a faint smile, a smile full of love but also of pain. I wanted to hug her immediately, to tell her I didn't blame her, but I didn't, not yet. Alexander spoke first, his voice low and filled with emotion, as if each word had been carefully weighed. "Paisley," he said, his gaze gentle but heavy, "I'm sorry for what happened back then. I left you, chose my own path, and I didn't know about Dean. I missed his entire life, and I also left you to bear the burden alone. I want to make it up, not just to Dean, but to you." My mother sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly on the table, her thin fingers trembling. I saw her eyes waver, as if drifting back to those old days. But then the present pain pulled her back. Tears rolled slowly down her cheeks, each drop carrying a fragment of shattered memories. "Alexander," she said, her voice choked, almost a whisper, "the past can't be undone. We chose different paths. I've lived with my choices, painful as they were. But Dean..." She turned to me, her eyes seeming to envelop my heart. "Dean is the one thing I don't regret. I just want you to be happy, to no longer live in the shame you endured." Her words pierced my chest like a blade. I took her hand, feeling the coldness of her thin fingers, and I couldn't hold back my tears. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling, "I don't blame you. I know you did your best. I just want you to be happy too, like I'm trying to be now." Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with remorse. "Paisley, let me help you," he said, his voice earnest. "You don't have to stay there, don't have to live with what's happened. You can start over and we can take care of Dean together." I nodded, holding her hand tighter. "Mom, let Dad and me help you," I said, hoping she would agree, hoping she would let herself be freed from those years of suffering. But she shook her head, her sad smile like a shattered painting. "Thank you both," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But I need to stay. I need to face what I've caused. Dean, live well. That's all I want." She stood up, came to me and hugged me tightly. I felt her warmth, but also her fragility, as if she were holding herself together to keep from breaking. Then she let go, looked at Alexander with eyes full of empathy, and left, leaving me and my father in a painful silence. I watched my mother's figure disappear, my heart heavy with emotion. But amidst that pain, I felt a new resolve. I didn't want to disappoint her. I wanted to live a life she could be proud of. and I knew that journey began here alongside the father I had just found. In the days that followed, I stepped into an entirely unfamiliar world. I left behind my small apartment, the quiet teaching days, and the simple life of a school teacher to follow Alexander into the world of business. A fierce and glamorous arena where every glance was scrutinizing, every word carefully weighed. Hale International Resorts, my father's hotel empire, was not just a company, it was a symbol of luxury, power, and ambition. When I first stepped into its headquarters with its shimmering glass walls and marble-lined corridors, I felt like a stranger lost in a palace. The early days were truly challenging. I sat through meetings where people discussed figures, strategies, and multi-million-dollar deals, while I quietly took notes, struggling to grasp unfamiliar terms like net profit or return on investment. My father's colleagues, men and women in expensive suits, looked at me with skeptical, sometimes contemptuous eyes. He's Hale's son, but what does he know about business? I overheard one whisper in a meeting room. The social gatherings were even more stifling. I stood among clinking wine glasses, forced smiles, and conversations about markets I didn't understand, feeling small and out of place. But my father, Alexander, never let me drown in self-doubt. He patiently guided me step by step, like a teacher mentoring a student. Every evening after long days at the office, he called me into his study, spreading out financial reports and explaining each figure with remarkable calm. "Dean," he said, his eyes encouraging, "you don't need to be great right away. You just need to be patient and you'll get there." He taught me how to manage staff, how to deal with partners, and how to stay calm under pressure. Once he brought me to a negotiation with a major investor, and when I stumbled over a question, he smiled, stepped in to cover for me, and later gently pointed out my mistakes so I could learn. But I didn't always progress. I made mistakes, and more than once they made me want to give up. One time I misread a contract, nearly costing the company an important client. My father's colleagues didn't miss the chance to criticize. "He doesn't belong here," one said bluntly to my face, his tone dripping with sarcasm. That night I returned to the new apartment my father had rented for me, sitting alone and feeling like the old Dean, the one who was never good enough. I stared out the window at the twinkling city lights, wondering if I was on the wrong path. But then I thought of my mother, her eyes when she said she wanted me to be happy. I thought of my father who had stood up for me against Malachi, and I thought of myself, the person who had endured years of scorn yet still stood up, still moved forward. I couldn't give up. I started working harder, listening to every piece of advice from my father, noting every detail, and observing how he handled tough situations. I learned to stand tall under skeptical gazes, to answer difficult questions, and to turn fear into motivation. Over time, I began to change. I was no longer the awkward man fumbling through meetings. I started offering ideas, some of which earned nods of approval from colleagues. I handled small issues, then larger ones. Once, when a partner deliberately tried to trip me up in a negotiation, I calmly presented my case, backing it up with figures I'd studied all night. The partner, who had initially looked at me with disdain, ended up nodding and shaking my hand. "Not bad, Dean," he said, and I felt a spark of pride ignite within me. The turning point came when my father entrusted me with a major deal, a project to build a new resort in Europe. I worked day and night, coordinating with the team, checking every detail from design to budget. There were moments I thought I would fail, but my father was always there, not just as a guide, but as someone who believed in me. When the contract was signed and the project approved, the meeting room erupted in applause. I looked at my father, and his eyes, filled with pride and love, left me choked up. That night in my father's office, it was just the two of us. He placed a hand on my shoulder and smiled. "Dean, you did it. I knew you could." I looked at him, feeling my heart warmer than ever before. "I didn't waste this chance," I whispered to myself. "Finally, I've proven my worth." For the first time, I no longer felt like an outsider. I was Dean, the son of Alexander Hale, and I belonged here. 2 years have passed since that fateful night, and my life has transformed in ways I never dared to dream. This year's Father's Day is no longer a painful memory, no longer filled with mocking words or contemptuous glances. Instead, I stand beside my real father in the lush garden behind his mansion. The table is set simply but warmly, with dishes he personally chose. Simple foods we both love, like toasted bread and beef stew. There are no extravagant relatives, no hollow toasts. Just me, my father, and a few of his close friends who have become my new family. I look at my father now in his late 50s, his salt and pepper hair sprinkled with a few more strands of silver, but his eyes still shining with determination and love. He raises his wine glass, smiling at me. "To you, Dean," he says, his voice warm and steady. "To our journey." I smile back, feeling a peace I've never known before. This isn't the false atmosphere of the Caldwell family where I was always pushed to the sidelines. This is genuine recognition, a sense of belonging, the home I've found after years of being lost. As we sit down, amid soft laughter and the golden sunlight filtering through the trees, I reflect on the journey I've taken. The truth about my lineage, buried for so many years, finally rose to the surface, like an ember that could not be extinguished. It tore down the walls I had built around myself, walls constructed from self-doubt and pain. I once thought my worth lay in the approval of Malachi, in the acceptance of the Caldwell family, but I was wrong. A person's value doesn't come from the labels others place on them or their biases. It lies in perseverance, in dignity, and in the relentless effort to rise, even when everything seems stacked against you. I am living proof of that. From a boy raised under contempt, always feeling inadequate, I found the truth and dared to confront it. I stepped through pain, failures, and skeptical glances to become the man I always longed to be. Confident, living true to my worth. The journey wasn't easy. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I had the strength to keep going. There were days I wanted to give up, to return to the simple life of a teacher where no one expected too much of me. But each time I remembered my mother's eyes, her wish for me to live well, and my father, the man who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. As the party ends, I stand beside my father, watching the sun dip below the hills. He pats my shoulder, his eyes full of pride. "You've come a long way, Dean," he says, "and I know you'll go even further." I smile, feeling my heart lighten. "Thank you, Dad," I say, my voice hoarse, "for giving me this chance." I stand there, breathing in the fresh air, and think about the message my journey carries. No matter how painful your starting point, no matter how the past tries to define you with harsh words, you can still rewrite your destiny. The truth, though buried, will always find a way to rise, and when it does, dare to face it, dare to move forward, because that's how you find yourself.